It is February 14th, 1493, and at this point in history, it is not at all certain that the first expedition across the Atlantic will make it back home. For days, a storm has been tearing at Columbus's ships. The sea will not let go. The hull groans, the sails strain, and the men on deck are praying for their lives. They have made vows to God. If they survive, they will go on pilgrimage. Columbus prays with them. Below deck, the Indians brought back from the islands were suffering too. Weak, seasick, burning with fever. Far from home, they lay in darkness, inside a ship that groaned and lurched through a world they had never known. Columbus knows the ship could still go under, and with it, all that he has worked for. So in the middle of the storm, he starts writing a short account of his discovery. He seals it, places it in a barrel, and throws it into the sea. If he dies, perhaps his legacy will not. But even if Columbus survives, his return will not unfold as he expects. The first monarch to hear his story will not be Ferdinand and Isabela. And that is only the first turn in a much darker story. Because the man who survives this storm will return to Spain in triumph. But by the end of this episode, he will return across the Atlantic in chains. After the incident at the Bay of Arrows, the first voyage had finally turned for home. At first, the return seemed almost merciful. The sea was calmer, the winds held. As the Niña and the Pinta pushed northeast, they entered strange waters, thick with drifting weed. Today, we know it as the Sargasso Sea. Above deck, the ocean was a wonder. Below it, the islanders were fading. The cold, the darkness, the endless motion of the sea, none of it belonged to the world they knew. One by one, they had begun to disappear. Only a few remained. Casamar was one of them. Macuya was another. They had left Guanahani together. They had crossed from island to island together. They had watched the strangers, translated their gestures, and tried to understand where this journey was taking them. Now, inside the dark belly of the ship, that journey was wearing them down. Then, on February 14th, 1493, came the storm. It drove the Niña and the Pinta apart. The Pinta vanished. Columbus no longer knew whether Pinzon was alive or lost at sea. Now the Niña was alone, a single battered vessel in a winter ocean, carrying Columbus, his men, and the few islanders still living. The sailors believed they might never see Spain again. They prayed and vowed in desperation to Our Lady of Guadalupe if she would see them home. And the ship held. But below deck, Macuya did not recover. Perhaps Casamar tried to keep him awake, but the ocean kept moving, and Macuya slipped away, far from the island where his name had first been spoken. Casamar remained, alone now, carried farther from the world they knew. On February 15th, land was finally sighted, Santa Maria in the Azores. It must have felt like deliverance. But this was not Spain. This was Portuguese territory. Part of the crew went ashore barefoot to fulfill the vows they had made in the storm, but the moment turned quickly. Portuguese authorities seized them, leaving Columbus aboard the Niña, forced to bargain from the water. Only after days of negotiation were his men released. Once more, the Niña turned toward Spain. But another storm drove Columbus off his course and into Lisbon. There, King João II received him with courtesy and with questions. The voyage had succeeded, but already a dangerous question surfaced. If Columbus had found new lands across the Atlantic, did they belong to Spain or to Portugal? Then, on March 15th, 1493, 224 days after he had left, the Niña reached Palos. The town erupted. Columbus had sailed west with 3 small ships and a claim few believed. Now, he had returned alive. Martín Alonso Pinzón's story ended differently. The Pinta had survived. Driven away in the storm, she had reached Spanish soil first, making port at Bayona. Pinzón tried to send word ahead, but the triumph was slipping away from him. By the time he returned, he was gravely ill. Soon after, he was dead, exhausted, overshadowed, and with little of the glory he may have hoped to claim. For Columbus, the return became a triumphal progress through Spain. By the time he reached Barcelona in April, his voyage had become a national sensation. Ferdinand and Isabela received him with extraordinary honor. They rose to greet him and had him seated before them, an exceptional distinction for a man of his rank. The gold, the parrots, the strange objects, the stories, all of it now served as proof that he had opened something immense. And Casimir, the boy from the small island of Guanahani, now stood before rulers from the far side of the world. Columbus had proven he could cross the ocean. Now, he had to prove something far harder. Could he rule what he had found? Triumph did not bring rest. It brought scale. While Columbus was being celebrated at court, Juan Rodriguez de Fonseca was turning victory into logistics. From Seville, he helped prepare a second expedition on an entirely different order. This time, Spain would not send out 3 fragile ships in search of rumor. It would send an armada. 17 ships, around 1,200 men, soldiers, priests, hidalgos, craftsmen, laborers, royal officials, and men who believed that gold would now come easily. Among them sailed the young nobleman Juan Ponce de Leon, the fleet's physician Diego Alvarez Chanca, who would set down the first account of this new world. Alonso de Ojeda came too, a fierce veteran of the Granada War, and Juan de la Cosa, who had already crossed this ocean once before. The second voyage was no longer just an expedition. It was the beginning of a colonial project, and among those drawn into that project was the boy from Guanahani. Columbus took Casimir into his household, not adoption as we would understand it, but a taking in into the admiral's house, his religion, and his authority. At baptism, the boy received a new name, Diego, the same name as Columbus's own brother. Whatever name he had carried on Guanahani would not survive in the Spanish record. From this point on, history would know him as Diego Colón. And under that new name, he sailed again. An interpreter, a witness, a boy made useful to the empire Spain now meant to build. On September 25th, 1493, the fleet left Cadiz. After a stop in the Canary Islands, it crossed the Atlantic. What had nearly destroyed Columbus on the homeward crossing now seemed to open before him with remarkable ease. In just 21 days, the ocean gave way to land. On the morning of November 3rd, a Sunday, the lookouts saw a mountainous green island rising from the sea. Columbus named it Dominica, after the Lord's Day on which it was sighted. To men fresh from autumn Spain, the sight must have felt almost unreal. Wet, fertile, overwhelmingly alive. Soon after, the fleet reached another island. Columbus named it Guadalupe, after the shrine in Spain they had vowed to visit if God spared them on the return from the first voyage. Here, the landscape seemed to exceed even the memories of the first crossing. A vast waterfall came crashing down from the heights, so high that it seemed to fall out of heaven itself. But wonder gave way to dread. In the abandoned villages, the Spaniards found what they feared. The physician, Chanca, recorded it plainly.
Human bones and skulls hung up about the houses, like vessels for holding things.
And the cooking pots seemed to confirm the darkest stories they had already heard. Then came the women, captives taken from other islands. As the Spaniards approached, they cried out, "Taíno! Taíno!" To them, it meant they were friendly, not Carib. But the Spaniards heard something else. A word, a name, one they would carry forward into their own understanding of the people of these islands. And with the women came darker stories still. They spoke of raids, of villages attacked, of children taken, of boys seized and prepared for consumption. To the Spaniards, these stories confirmed what they already feared. The islands ahead would not all be Guanahani. From Guadalupe, the fleet moved north, past Montserrat and Antigua. At Santa Cruz came the first clash. A canoe carrying 4 Carib men, 2 women, and a young boy suddenly faced the entire Spanish fleet. For nearly an hour, they stared. Then a Spanish boat slipped in along the shore. Trapped, they fought back. Arrows flew. The Spanish boat closed in. The canoe was overturned. And even then, the women kept shooting. It was a small encounter, but it changed the tone of the voyage. This archipelago had its own rivalries, its own violence, its own geography of captivity and war. From there, the fleet crossed the scattered Virgin Islands and continued toward Borinquen, the fertile island later called Puerto Rico. The map was opening fast now, and somewhere ahead stood La Navidad, where the 39 men had been waiting for almost 11 months. Soon, the fleet would reach them. Columbus sailed on. At the mouth of the Rio de Oro, the first sign appeared that something was wrong. 2 bodies were found there, bound with ropes. One of them had a beard. It was a small discovery, but a terrible one. And suddenly, the return to La Navidad no longer felt like a reunion. On the evening of November 27, 1493, the fleet anchored near the place where the settlement should have stood. Night had already fallen. Columbus ordered a lombard to be fired, announcing his return. No answer came back. No signal fire. No shot from the shore. No men rushing down to greet them. Only darkness and silence. At dawn, the truth emerged. La Navidad was gone. The fort had been burned to the ground. The first Spanish outpost in the New World was now ash, charred timber, and blackened earth. This was not a deserted post. It was a ruin. Later that day, a group of Taínos approached the ships in a canoe. They were relatives of Guacanagarí, the cacique who had once welcomed Columbus as a friend. They brought gifts, 2 masks of gold, a gesture of diplomacy. And with it, the news Columbus had feared. All 39 men left behind at La Navidad were dead. The story that followed was not simply one of attack. It was one of collapse. Almost as soon as Columbus had sailed away, the Spaniards began to turn on one another. Discipline dissolved. They quarreled over gold, over women, over rank. Instead of holding together under Diego de Araña, they split apart. Some stayed at the fort. Others pushed inland in smaller bands, raiding, searching for gold, taking women, and ignoring the orders they had been given. The garrison had broken apart. And in that land, another power was rising to meet them. Caonabó, a formidable cacique, linked to the gold-bearing interior and unwilling to tolerate a foreign foothold on the island. According to the accounts gathered afterward, the Spaniards who pushed into his sphere were cut down first. Then, once the garrison had been weakened and divided, La Navidad itself was attacked. By then, too few remained. The fort was set on fire. Some fled toward the shore. Some were killed in the fighting. Others vanished into the night and were never seen again. By the time Columbus returned, the settlement was no longer a colony. It was a warning. Still, one ally remained, or seemed to. Columbus went to see Guacanagari at his camp. The cacique lay in a hammock, his leg wrapped in bandages. He claimed he had been wounded while defending the Christians against Caonabó's attack. It was a useful story, perhaps too useful. Columbus asked Dr. Chanca to examine the wound. Guacanagari cried out at the touch. But when the wrappings were removed, there was nothing there. No wound, no cut, no scar, no sign of injury at all. The bandages had concealed nothing, because there was nothing to conceal. The Spanish camp turned bitter. Father Buil and several officers demanded revenge. If Guacanagari had deceived them, then he too should be seized or killed. But Columbus refused. His first settlement was already in ashes. His men had helped bring on their own destruction. He would not now turn against the only local ruler still willing to deal with him. It was a calculated decision, and not everyone accepted it. The first deep cracks in Columbus's authority were already beginning to show. He had returned with 17 ships, with priests, soldiers, and the promise of empire. And the first thing he found was ruin. If Spain was to remain here, it would have to begin again. So Columbus sailed east. He chose a new site on the northern coast of Hispaniola. He named it La Isabela, in honor of the Queen. To the Spaniards, the choice seemed to make sense. The place lay within reach of the gold-bearing interior. There was stone nearby, fresh water, a harbor, everything needed, it seemed, for permanence. But the land itself would prove less welcoming. La Isabela rose in a low, unhealthy landscape, wet, airless, and thick with insects. And yet this was where Columbus decided Spain would build its first true town in the New World. Not a fort this time, a town. Stone buildings began to rise. A church, a hospital, storehouses, and a fortified house for the admiral himself. It was a powerful statement. Spain was not here to visit. It was here to stay. But the cost was immediate. Within weeks, sickness spread through the settlement. Men weakened, then collapsed. Fever, flux, hunger, exhaustion. Even Columbus himself was left bedridden for a time. The food did little to save them. Much of what had come from Spain had spoiled in the heat. Rations had to be cut, and the men who had crossed the ocean dreaming of gold now found themselves starving in a settlement of mud, stone, and mosquitoes. Even then, the physician Chanca was filling pages with wonders.
Many marvelous things have been seen. Trees that bore wool, fine enough to be woven into cloth.
The same letter counted the sick. The hidalgos hated it most. These were men of the lower nobility, or men who claimed its privileges, shaped by a world of war, honor, and service. Many had come of age in the final years of the Reconquista. They had not crossed to the Indies to dig trenches or haul stone in the tropical heat. But Columbus forced them to work, and with every order, resentment deepened. To many of them, he was not only a hard commander, he was a foreigner, a Genoese admiral commanding Castilian gentlemen. The tension soon hardened into conspiracy. Bernal de Pisa, the royal comptroller sent with the fleet, began plotting to seize the ships. If he could get back to Spain, he could tell the crown what Columbus wanted hidden. The colony was sick, hungry, unpaid, and already unraveling. But Columbus discovered the plot before it could move. He acted quickly. Bernal de Pisa was arrested and confined aboard ship. To prevent another attempt, the admiral placed sails, weapons, and key supplies under tight guard in the hands of men he still trusted. It was the first mutiny of the new colony. Columbus had stopped it, but he had not stopped the hunger, the sickness, or the anger of men who still expected gold. If La Isabela was to survive, Columbus needed more than obedience. He needed proof. He needed gold. If the colony was to survive, Columbus had to prove that the gold was real. So in March 1494, he left the sickly misery of La Isabela behind and marched inland with some 400 armed men. He would not rely on rumor now. He wanted to see the wealth of Hispaniola with his own eyes and silence his critics in the colony and at court. He left La Isabela in the hands of his brother, Diego, pious, earnest, and far softer in temperament than Christopher. But his authority was fragile from the start. The hidalgos resented taking orders from a foreigner's brother, especially one who made gentlemen labor in mud and heat. Their brother Bartholomew was still in Europe. Christopher pushed deep into the island, toward the gold-bearing heart of Cibao. Roads had to be cut by hand. Food ran short, and the farther they went, the clearer it became that this was not empty country. Then, at last, Cibao. Rugged, stony, cut through by rivers where gold could be found. But it was not only a landscape of promise. It lay close to the sphere of Caonabó, the cacique linked to the destruction of La Navidad. Here, Columbus saw enough to know the riches were real. So he ordered a fort. He named it Santo Tomás, St. Thomas, the doubting apostle, a name aimed at everyone who still doubted the gold was there. He left Pedro Marguerite to hold it with 56 men and turned back toward La Isabela. He had answered the doubters, but the answer had created a new danger. On April 1st, word came back from Santo Tomás. The district was emptying. its people abandoning their villages, and Caonabó was preparing to burn the fort. Deep inland, exposed, hard to reach, Santo Tomas was becoming a target. If it fell, the whole venture into Cibao might collapse before it had begun. The next day, the 2nd, Columbus sent 70 men with food and munitions, some to hold the fort, some to cut a better road to reach it. But he was already stretched thin. La Isabela was sick. The ships needed preparing. The men still wanted gold. And now, Caonabó was testing the Spanish foothold in the interior. By the 9th, he sent Ojeda inland with more than 400. The search for gold had crossed a line. This was no longer exploration. It was becoming a campaign to control the interior. With the work at La Isabela still unfinished, Columbus was already preparing to leave again. The colony was sick. The men were restless. The gold had not come as promised. But Columbus still believed one discovery could hold it all together. If Cuba was mainland, his claim to Asia could survive. If it was only an island, everything he had promised would begin to weaken. On April 24, 1494, Columbus left La Isabela behind and sailed west again, leaving his brother, Diego Columbus, in charge of the council. Diego Colón, once Casimir, would come with him. He took 3 ships, the Niña, the San Juan, and the Cardera. His purpose was more precise than ever, to prove that Cuba was no island, but the mainland of Asia. But on the way, another rumor pulled him south: gold. So instead of following Cuba's coast at once, Columbus turned toward a new island. On May 5th, he reached an island its people called Zaimaca. Columbus named it Santiago. Today, we know it by its older name, Jamaica. What he found there impressed him deeply. Broad green valleys, well-watered land, and canoes of astonishing size, some long enough to carry dozens of men. But admiration did not last long. At Santa Gloria, the Spaniards found themselves surrounded by some 60 canoes. Men shouted, spears flew. Columbus had already seen what a fragile outpost could become at La Navidad. He had no intention of letting events slip. He sent out an armed boat. Crossbows were used, and for the first time on this expedition, one of the large dogs was unleashed as a weapon. The attack broke the confrontation. The canoes scattered, and the Spaniards regained control of the bay. 3 days later, Columbus had seen enough. There was no gold here worth staying for, so he turned back north toward Cuba once more. He began tracing Cuba's southern coast, convinced he was nearing the Golden Chersonese, the Malay Peninsula of old geography, the very threshold of Asia. But what followed was not a triumphal voyage of discovery. It was a long, grinding passage through heat, mud, and illusion. His ships entered a maze of islands, sandbanks, and shallows, channels so narrow that they ran aground in the sand. Columbus gave this archipelago a poetic name, Jardín de la Reina, the Garden of the Queen, in honor of Isabela. It was beautiful and exhausting. The coast seemed endless. Wherever the Spaniards landed to ask the way, the answer was the same. It went on and on. Diego Colón carried those answers from one world into another, but Columbus heard in them only what he needed to hear: confirmation. Not an island, the edge of Asia. By now, the strain was wearing them down. The ships leaked. Storms tore at the sails. The biscuits were bad, the water stale, and the men weakened week by week on strict rations. And Columbus himself began to pay the price. Sleeplessness, exhaustion, and the first signs that his eyesight was failing under the relentless glare of sun on water. Yet even then, he did not turn back from the idea. The coast still stretched ahead. The sea still withheld its answer. And Columbus pressed on, more determined than ever to find Asia in a world that was not Asia at all. By early June, the voyage had reached a dangerous point, not only for the ships, for Columbus himself. Only 2 years earlier, at Santa Fe, the crown had promised him extraordinary rewards. Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, Governor, and a share in the wealth of whatever lands he discovered. But those privileges rested on a claim that he had reached the Indies, that these were not merely islands, but the edge of Asia itself. And now, off the coast of Cuba, that claim was under pressure. The men were exhausted, the ships were damaged, the food was going bad, and still, the coast went on. For Columbus, there were two possible answers. Either Cuba was an island, or it was mainland, tierra firme. The first answer would weaken everything he had promised. The second would preserve it. After weeks of strain, Columbus stopped waiting for the sea to decide. If the coast would not give him certainty, he would make it himself. On June 12, 1494, he called for the notary, Fernando Perez de Luna. Then he ordered him to go from ship to ship and take sworn statements from the men, officers, pilots, sailors, even ship's boys. Each one was to declare that Cuba was not an island, but mainland. The reasoning was simple. No island, they were told, could have a coast this long. No island could stretch so far without an end. But this was not proof. It was certainty, manufactured on paper. The notary moved between the vessels, carrying Columbus's version of the world from one deck to another. And the oath carried threats. Anyone who later denied that Cuba was mainland could face a ruinous fine. For common sailors, the punishment was even worse: the loss of the tongue. So the men swore, not because the map was clear, not because the question had been answered, but because Columbus had made doubt dangerous. Among those who accepted the oath was Juan de la Cosa, owner of the Santa Maria and veteran of the first crossing. Years later, that same de la Cosa would draw a map that showed Cuba as an island. It would become the first surviving European map to show the Americas as something separate. But here, under Columbus, he gave the answer the admiral required. A few days later, Columbus turned back. He had come close to the western end of Cuba. Close enough that a little more sailing might have shattered the illusion. But he did not continue. The line on the map bent away, and Columbus carried his certainty with him, not discovered, but sworn. When Columbus returned to La Isabela, he was badly weakened. The voyage along Cuba had drained him. Heat, hunger, weeks at sea. And the colony had not improved in his absence. By then, Bartholomew Columbus had reached the island with supplies from Spain. Harder, more forceful, and more practical than his brother Diego, he soon became one of the admiral's most important men on Hispaniola, and he had arrived at a moment of danger. Caonabó was still free, the cacique linked to the destruction of La Navidad and the strongest enemy of the interior. While he remained free, Spanish control of Cibao was never secure. So Columbus turned again to Alonso de Ojeda. This time, Ojeda did not march against Caonabó with an army. He came with a small party, a horse, and a gift. He approached the cacique not as an enemy, but as an honored guest. The gift was meant for Caonabó himself, a pair of polished metal ornaments, bright enough to impress, strange enough to seem royal. Ojeda told him they were worn by the kings of Castile. The gesture was public, flattering, difficult to refuse. Caonabó agreed to put them on. Only then did the meaning change. The metal closed. The trap was sprung. Ojeda lifted Caonabó onto his horse and carried him away before his people could react. Later, Cortés and Pizarro would become famous for this approach, seizing a ruler at the center of his own power. But Ojeda did it first. The most dangerous threat to Spanish control was brought to La Isabela in chains. Caonabó would never regain his freedom. Marked for transport across the ocean, he would die before reaching Spain. But his capture solved nothing deeper. The Spaniards still wanted gold. The crown still expected results, and Columbus needed a system to turn conquest into revenue. So in 1495, tribute became policy. In the gold-bearing regions, every Taíno above the age of 14 was expected, every 3 months, to bring in a small hawk's bell filled with gold dust. It was a tiny object, but the demand behind it was enormous. Gold did not exist on the scale Columbus imagined, and yet the measure remained the same: a bell filled with gold. Again and again. Where there was no gold, the demand was cotton, 25 pounds of spun cotton. Those who paid received a small copper token hung around the neck, proof the demand had been met, and a few more months of safety. Without it, there was danger. Patrols stopped people, checked for the token, and punished those who had none. For the Taínos, the system reached into daily life. Time that had gone to planting, fishing, and feeding families was pulled toward tribute. Villages emptied, crops failed. Some fled into the mountains. Some destroyed their own fields, hoping hunger would drive the Spaniards out. But the hunger spread instead. What Columbus called pacification was becoming something else. Not peace, control. For Diego Colón, the meaning was becoming harder to escape. The strangers had not come only to pass through. Forts, raids, tribute, punishment. The island was being forced into a new order. And Columbus himself was changing too. The man who had returned in triumph only a few years before now seemed worn down by sickness, accusation, and failure. In March 1496, he left Hispaniola for Spain. This time, there was no triumph. When he reached Cadiz, Columbus appeared thin, unshaven, exhausted, and dressed in the rough brown habit of a Franciscan friar. It was an image of humility, perhaps of repentance, perhaps also of defense. The first voyage had brought him home as the admiral who had crossed the ocean sea. The second brought him back as the governor of a colony already slipping out of his control. Columbus had crossed the ocean sea twice, but by 1498, that was no longer enough. Discovery had made him famous. It had not made him secure. His colony was unstable, his enemies were growing, and the promises he had made were becoming harder to defend. So the question now was no longer whether Columbus could find new lands. It was whether one more voyage could save everything he was beginning to lose. The crown still needed him, but no longer trusted him without question. The third voyage came slowly. Money was harder to secure, men were harder to recruit, and Juan Rodriguez de Fonseca, now one of the key organizers of Spain's Atlantic enterprise, stood more openly in his way. Later accounts even claimed that the tension broke into violence, that Columbus, in anger, struck one of Fonseca's men. Whether every detail is true or not, the meaning was clear. The admiral of the ocean sea was no longer untouchable. At last, in May 1498, Columbus sailed again from Sanlúcar. This time, there was no armada, only 6 ships. Some were sent on toward Hispaniola with supplies for a colony already strained by hunger, unrest, and distrust. Columbus took the others on a different course, farther south than he had ever gone before. He was still searching, still trying to prove that the lands he had found were the Indies he had promised. So he pushed south, into heat, into stillness, into a sea where the wind seemed to die. The ships entered the calms near the equator. Day after day, the sails hung useless. The sun beat down with terrifying force. Water turned foul. Grain spoiled. The hoops of the barrels loosened and burst. Men feared the ships themselves might catch fire from the heat. There was almost no water left. Then, on July 31st, land appeared. 3 peaks rising from the horizon. Columbus had vowed to name the first land he saw for the Holy Trinity, and so the island became known as Trinidad. But beyond Trinidad lay something stranger still. The ships entered waters where the sea itself seemed changed. Fresh water poured outward with such force that it pushed against the salt. Currents twisted around the vessels. The mouth of a vast river was somewhere ahead. This could not be explained by a small island. For the first time, Columbus was facing something larger than the archipelago he knew. A coast, a mass of land, a world his old maps could not contain. Beyond Trinidad, the ships entered the Gulf between the island and the long coast to the west. Today, we know it as the Gulf of Paria. Columbus called the land Tierra de Gracia, the land of grace. The Spaniards also recorded a local name for the region, Paria. But the waters here were dangerous. The channels twisted between island and coast, and Columbus gave them names that matched the fear they inspired. The serpent's mouth, the dragon's mouth, Boca del Dragón. The fresh water told him this was no ordinary island coast. Something vast lay beyond it. Columbus called it another world, otro mundo. And still, he did not let go of the Indies. Along the coast, the Spaniards saw people wearing strings of real pearls. Pearls on the arms, pearls around the neck, pearls traded for broken pieces of Castilian pottery. For the men, it was wealth. For Columbus, it was proof. Another sign that he was nearing the wonders of the East. But the world before him was becoming harder to explain. So Columbus reached for an even stranger explanation. The Earth, he wrote, was not perfectly round. It rose near the equator like a pear, or like a woman's breast, raised toward heaven at a single point. At that sacred height, he believed, stood the earthly paradise, the Garden of Eden. And the great river before him might be one of the rivers flowing down from it. It was mystical, but it solved a problem. It allowed Columbus to hold the discovery inside the world he already believed in. Not a world separate from the Indies, a sacred edge of them, a threshold where geography, faith, and ambition could still be made to agree. But while Columbus searched for paradise, Hispaniola was slipping further into rebellion. By the time Columbus returned, the center of Spanish power on Hispaniola had begun to shift. La Isabela, the sickly town on the northern coast, was no longer enough. On the southern coast, near the Ozama River, Bartholomew had founded a new settlement, Santo Domingo. It was there that Columbus arrived on August 30th, 1498. He had come from waters he thought might touch the edge of paradise, but in Santo Domingo, there was no paradise waiting for him. The old trouble with his eyes had returned. After weeks of heat, glare, and sleepless watches, his sight was failing again. He entered the colony nearly blind, hoping to find rest among his own people. Instead, he found rebellion. During his long absence, Hispaniola had come apart. Supplies had failed, sickness had spread, men had died, and the authority of his brothers, Diego and Bartholomew, had been worn down almost to breaking point. The leader of the revolt was Francisco Roldan. That made it even more dangerous. Roldan was not an outsider. Columbus himself had raised him to power, appointing him alcalde mayor, chief judge of the island. He should have defended the admiral's authority. Instead, he turned that authority against him. At first, Roldan claimed to be seeking justice, a ship to Castile, a way to tell the crown how badly the colony was being governed, a way to escape the rule of the Columbus brothers. But beneath that claim was a harder promise. Roldan wrote to men who still claimed loyalty to Columbus and offered them what the admiral could not: food, gold, freedom, Indian labor, and Indian women without the restraints the Columbus brothers had imposed. The message spread, and it worked. Men who had been hungry for months began to listen. Men who had cursed Columbus in private now found a leader willing to say it aloud. Soon, Columbus could no longer know who still belonged to him. Roldan gathered armed followers and withdrew west into the fertile province of Jaragua. Along the way, his men opened storehouses and took weapons, clothing, food, and animals. What had begun as protest became an armed standoff. Columbus could not crush the revolt. He had to negotiate. Roldan knew it. He was allowed to remain aboard one of the royal ships. That image mattered. The rebel judge was eating from royal stores aboard a royal vessel. Columbus, the admiral of the ocean sea, was bargaining from the shore. It was more than an insult. It showed how far Columbus's authority had fallen. He no longer controlled even his own ships in his own harbor. He understood the danger, but understanding it was not the same as stopping it. When Columbus tried to gather men who might fight for him, fewer than 70 appeared, and of those, not even 40 could truly be trusted. So Columbus negotiated. The agreement was humiliating. Roldan was restored to office. His followers were pardoned. Back wages were promised, and those who stayed would receive land, status, and a place in the island's new order. Columbus had survived the revolt by rewarding it. And to buy peace, Columbus opened another door. Repartimiento, a division. The tribute system had not saved the colony, so now people themselves would be assigned. Groups of Indians were placed under the authority of individual Spaniards to work, to serve, and to make settlement profitable. What was being divided was not land, it was power over human lives. For Columbus, it was a concession made under pressure. For Hispaniola, it was a turning point. The colony was no longer held together by discovery, tribute, or royal promises. It was being held together by bargains with armed men. And word of it was crossing the ocean. In Spain, the crown had begun to ask whether the admiral could govern at all. The reports from Hispaniola had become too serious to ignore. Men returned to court with stories of hunger, unpaid wages, cruel punishments, and rebellion. They accused Columbus and his brothers of misrule, of violence, of being unable to govern the men they had brought across the ocean. Some even warned that Columbus had become too powerful in the lands he had discovered. For years, Isabela had protected him, but now, even her confidence was beginning to weaken. So the crown sent a judge, Francisco de Bobadilla. He was not sent as a guest. He crossed the ocean with royal documents, signed in the names of Ferdinand and Isabela. He had power to investigate, power to command, and if necessary, power to replace the admiral himself. On August 23, 1500, Bobadilla entered the harbor of Santo Domingo. What he saw first was not order, not loyalty, not the peaceful colony Columbus had promised. Near the water, the bodies of executed Spaniards hung from the gallows. Other prisoners were still waiting for judgment. The town was tense, divided, watching. For Bobadilla, the conclusion came quickly. This was no longer a colony in difficulty. It was a colony under violent rule. And Columbus was not even there. He was inland, trying to impose order in another troubled province. His brother Diego was in Santo Domingo. Bobadilla moved quickly. He read his royal powers before the people. He took possession of the admiral's house. He seized documents, gold, and royal property. He presented himself not as a messenger, but as the new authority on the island. To many settlers, he did not look like an intruder. He looked like relief. The Columbus brothers had made many enemies, and now those enemies had someone to speak to. Bobadilla summoned Columbus in the name of the crown. When the royal order reached him, Columbus obeyed. He returned to Santo Domingo, but he was no longer received as Admiral of the Ocean Sea, not as Viceroy, not as Governor. He was treated as a man under suspicion. Bobadilla did not wait for a long defense. he arrested him. Diego was arrested with him, Bartholomew too. The three brothers who had tried to rule Hispaniola were now prisoners of the very crown they had served. Then came the chains, heavy iron, fastened around the man who had crossed the ocean and returned as the discoverer of the Indies. Columbus did not fight. He did not call the settlers to his side. There were too few left who would have answered. The man who had entered Spain in triumph was now led toward a ship as a captive. The same ocean that had made him famous would carry him home again, but not as a discoverer, as a prisoner. The ship pulled away from Santo Domingo. The harbor sounds faded into the sea, and below deck, in the darkness of the hold, Columbus sat alone, waiting to learn whether Spain would still see him as the man who had found the Indies, or as the man who had lost control of them.